Let me tell you something right away. Learning is not magic, and it's definitely not about talent. If learning feels slow, painful, or confusing, it's usually because you're doing it the polite way, the socially acceptable way, the way that looks like learning but actually isn't. Real learning is messy. It's uncomfortable. And when done correctly, it feels almost unfair. Here's the secret most people miss. Learning doesn't happen when information goes in. It happens when confusion comes out. Most people try to learn by collecting facts. They read books, watch videos, highlight sentences, nod their heads, and say, yeah, that makes sense. But making sense is not the same thing as understanding. Understanding begins the moment you try to explain something and suddenly realize you can't. That moment right there is gold. Because the fastest learners don't avoid confusion. They hunt it down. When you start learning a skill, don't ask, how much can I absorb? Ask, what don't I understand yet? Then attack that. Don't learn the whole subject. Learn the smallest piece that actually does something. If you're learning a language, don't study grammar rules for months. Learn how to say one useful sentence, then break it, fix it, and rebuild it. If you're learning a technical skill, don't memorize definitions. Use it badly. Make mistakes on purpose. See what breaks. Speed comes from interaction, not consumption. Another mistake people make is pretending to understand things they don't. They say, I get the idea, and move on. Never do that. If you truly understand something, you should be able to explain it without fancy words, without hiding behind complexity, without notes. If you can't explain it simply, you don't own it yet. And that's not a failure. That's a map. Every gap in your explanation tells you exactly what to learn next. Now here's the part that feels illegal. You don't need motivation. You don't need discipline. You don't even need confidence. You need curiosity. When you're genuinely curious, your brain works faster, remembers more, and connects ideas automatically. Curiosity turns effort into play. So instead of asking, how long will this take to learn? Ask, what happens if I push this idea just a little further? That question alone can save you years. And finally, remember this. The goal of learning is not to sound smart, it's to see clearly. When you see clearly, complexity collapses. When complexity collapses, speed appears. And when speed appears, learning starts to feel almost illegal. Almost. Learning doesn't begin when you sit down with a book, open a video, or listen to someone who sounds confident. It begins at a much more uncomfortable moment. The moment when something doesn't make sense anymore. Most people think confusion is a sign that learning has failed. In reality, confusion is the only reliable signal that learning has finally started. Until you feel confused, nothing new is actually happening in your mind. You're just recognizing patterns you already half knew and mistaking familiarity for understanding. The brain is very good at pretending. It nods along when ideas sound reasonable. It fills in gaps with vague impressions. It gives you the pleasant illusion that you understand something simply because you've heard it explained smoothly. But the moment you try to explain that same idea yourself, without notes, without copying phrases, the illusion collapses. Suddenly there are holes, missing steps, words you can't replace with simpler ones. That collapse is not failure, it's a breakthrough. You've just located the exact place where your understanding ends. Most people rush past that moment. They feel the discomfort and immediately escape it. They rewind the video, reread the paragraph, or look for another explanation that feels easier. This creates a dangerous habit, avoiding confusion instead of confronting it. But speed in learning doesn't come from avoiding discomfort. It comes from staying with it longer than most people are willing to. Confusion is like a signpost pointing directly at what needs to be learned next. Ignore it, and you wander in circles. Face it, and progress becomes inevitable. When confusion appears, something important is happening. Your brain is being forced to build a new structure instead of relying on borrowed ones. You're no longer just repeating information, you're trying to make it stand on its own. That effort is what creates durable knowledge. It's also why learning sometimes feels slow at first. Building understanding is heavier than memorizing words. But once the structure is built, Everything attached to it becomes easier, faster, and more reliable. The fastest learners aren't the ones who understand quickly. They're the ones who identify confusion quickly. They don't ask, do I get this? They ask, where exactly does this stop making sense? That question turns confusion into a tool instead of a threat. Instead of feeling lost, they feel guided. Every unclear step becomes a precise target. Every mistake becomes useful information. There's another reason confusion is so powerful. It forces honesty. You can't hide behind fancy language or surface familiarity when something truly doesn't make sense. Confusion strips away pretending. It demands that you either rebuild the idea from the ground up or admit you don't yet know it. That honesty is rare, and it's the reason so many people plateau. They protect their sense of competence instead of protecting their learning. Once you change your relationship with confusion, everything accelerates. You stop trying to look smart and start trying to see clearly. You stop measuring progress by how much you've covered and start measuring it by how many questions you've answered. Learning becomes lighter, more direct, and strangely satisfying. What once felt frustrating begins to feel like progress in its purest form. In the end, confusion isn't the enemy of learning. It's the doorway. If you learn to recognize it, stay with it, and work through it instead of around it, your progress won't just improve. It will compound. And that's when learning starts to feel fast in a way that almost doesn't seem fair. Most people believe learning is about gathering more information. They think progress comes from reading more books, watching more videos, taking more notes, and collecting more explanations. The result is often impressive on the surface. Shelves full of material, folders packed with notes, and a head full of terms that sound familiar. But beneath all that activity, very little understanding has actually formed. Information by itself doesn't create skill. It only creates the illusion of progress. The real obstacle isn't a lack of resources, it's a lack of precision. When learners don't know exactly what they're missing, they compensate by consuming everything. They hope clarity will eventually appear through sheer volume. It rarely does. What usually happens instead is mental overload. Important ideas blur together, details fade, and confidence drops because nothing feels solid. Learning slows not because the subject is hard, but because effort is being scattered instead of focused. Fast learning works in the opposite direction. Instead of asking, what else should I learn? The question becomes, what exactly don't I understand yet? This shift changes everything. The moment you identify a gap, a step you can't explain, a result you can't predict, a concept you can't connect, you've found the most valuable place to focus. One clear gap is worth more than hours of unfocused study. Attacking gaps requires honesty and restraint. It means resisting the urge to move forward just to feel productive. It means stopping at the exact point where understanding breaks and refusing to proceed until that break is repaired. This feels slow at first, but it's not. It's efficient. Every minute spent repairing a gap prevents hours of confusion later. When gaps are ignored, they don't disappear. They multiply. Small misunderstandings quietly spread, and eventually the whole structure becomes unstable. There's also a psychological reason people avoid gaps. They're uncomfortable. Gaps expose what you don't know, and that can feel like weakness. In learning, gaps are not flaws, they are instructions. They tell you precisely what your next step should be. Without them, learning becomes guesswork. With them, learning becomes targeted and deliberate. When you focus on gaps, the size of the task shrinks. Instead of trying to master an entire subject, you're only fixing one broken link at a time. This makes learning manageable. It also makes it measurable. Each repaired gap strengthens your confidence because it's real, not imagined. You're no longer hoping you understand. You know exactly what you can explain and use. Another powerful effect of attacking gaps is that it changes how new information fits in. Once a gap is repaired, related ideas suddenly make sense with very little effort. What once felt complicated becomes obvious. This is because understanding is cumulative. Each solid piece makes the next one easier to place. Speed emerges naturally, not from rushing, but from building on stable foundations. People who learn quickly aren't racing ahead blindly. They are constantly checking for weak points and reinforcing them. They test their understanding, look for inconsistencies, and challenge themselves to explain ideas in simple terms. Whenever something feels vague, they stop and investigate instead of moving on. This habit compounds over time. Small corrections early prevent massive confusion later. In the end, learning efficiently is not about doing more. It's about doing the right thing at the right time. Attacking gaps turns learning from a passive activity into an active process. It replaces overwhelm with clarity and replaces frustration with momentum. When every effort is aimed at a specific we-ness, progress stops feeling random. It becomes intentional, reliable, and surprisingly fast, not because the subject got easier, but because your approach became sharper. Most people approach learning as if the goal is to absorb an entire subject before doing anything with it. They believe competence comes first and action comes later. So they prepare endlessly. They study frameworks, watch tutorials, read guides, and tell themselves they're not ready yet. What they don't realize is that this mindset quietly slows everything down. Skills are not built by preparation alone. They are built through use, especially imperfect use. The fastest way to learn is not to wait until you feel confident, but to start before you are. Using a skill early exposes realities that theory alone can never reveal. The moment you try to apply what you've learned, questions appear that no book warned you about. Things behave differently than expected. Mistakes show up immediately. This feedback is priceless. It turns vague knowledge into concrete understanding. When you use a skill before you're ready, you stop learning in the abstract and start learning in context. Instead of memorizing rules, you see why they exist. Instead of following steps blindly, you understand what happens when a step is skipped or done incorrectly. Each mistake becomes a data point, not a failure. It tells you what matters and what doesn't. People often avoid early use because they fear getting things wrong. But getting things wrong is the mechanism. Errors force the brain to adjust. When something breaks, the mind becomes alert. Attention sharpens. Memory strengthens. This is why lessons learned through mistakes are remembered far longer than lessons learned through passive study. Struggle, when paired with feedback, leaves a deeper imprint than comfort ever could. Another advantage of early use is that it reveals priorities. Not everything you study is equally important. Some concepts matter immediately, while others rarely come into play. By using the skill early, you discover which parts are essential and which can wait. This prevents wasted effort. Instead of learning everything just in case, you learn what actually moves the skill forward. Using a skill badly is also a powerful filter for clarity. When you try to perform, any misunderstanding becomes obvious. You can't hide behind familiar language or half-remembered explanations. Either it works or it doesn't. That clarity directs your next step. You no longer ask, what should I study next? The answer presents itself through the outcome of your attempt. There is also a confidence shift that happens through early use. Confidence doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from surviving mistakes and realizing they are manageable. Each attempt proves that failure is not catastrophic. Over time, this reduces hesitation. You experiment more. You try variations. You push boundaries. Learning accelerates because fear no longer slows you down. Importantly, using a skill early does not mean being reckless. It means choosing small, controlled applications. Simple tasks, low stakes, short feedback loops. These conditions make mistakes safe and informative. The goal isn't to perform perfectly. It's to observe what happens. With each attempt, understanding deepens. Many people believe mastery is a straight line. Study first, practice later. In reality, it's a loop. Try, fail, adjust, try again. Each loop tightens understanding. Each repetition refines judgment. Waiting too long to enter this loop delays progress. Entering it early compresses the learning timeline dramatically. In the end, readiness is not a prerequisite for learning. It is a result of learning. Action creates clarity. Use reveals gaps. Mistakes teach faster than explanations. When you stop waiting for confidence and start engaging with the skill directly, learning stops feeling slow and uncertain. It becomes responsive, grounded, and fast, not because you avoided errors, but because you welcome them as part of the process. Many people believe that understanding something means being able to repeat it. They can recall definitions, quote explanations, and recognize correct answers when they see them. This feels like knowledge, and to a certain extent it is, but it's a fragile kind of knowledge. The moment the context changes or the problem is slightly different, it falls apart. Real understanding is not about recognition. It's about reconstruction. The true test of understanding is whether you can take an idea apart and put it back together using your own words. If you can't explain something simply without leaning on specialized language or memorized phrases, then the idea hasn't settled yet. It's still external. It lives in notes, books, or someone else's explanation, not in your thinking. Complex language is often mistaken for depth. In reality, complexity can hide confusion. When people don't fully understand something, they tend to repeat it exactly as they learned it. They rely on the original structure because they don't trust themselves to rebuild it. Simple explanation requires courage. It forces you to expose what you truly know and what you don't. When you try to explain an idea in plain language, gaps appear almost instantly. You reach a step that feels obvious but can't justify it. You sense a connection but can't articulate why it exists. These moments are not embarrassing, they are diagnostic. They reveal precisely where understanding is incomplete. No test or exam can give you feedback this clean. Explaining something simply also strips away unnecessary detail. Many subjects are wrapped in layers of formality that make them feel more complicated than they are. When you explain an idea to someone with no background, you are forced to identify what actually matters. You learn which parts are essential and which are decorative. This clarity strengthens understanding and makes recall easier. There is also a powerful internal effect. Explaining an idea out loud forces your brain to slow down and organize thoughts in sequence. Vague impressions must become concrete steps. Assumptions must be justified. This process turns scattered knowledge into a coherent structure. Once that structure exists, you can rebuild it quickly whenever needed. That's why true understanding feels flexible instead of rigid. People often avoid simple explanation because it feels risky. It exposes uncertainty. But avoiding that risk keeps understanding shallow. Pretending to understand protects the ego, but it sabotages progress. Growth requires accepting temporary discomfort in exchange for long-term clarity. Another benefit of simple explanation is transfer. When you understand something deeply enough to explain it plainly, you can apply it in new situations. You're no longer tied to specific examples or formats. You see the underlying principle and recognize it wherever it appears. This is what allows experts to solve unfamiliar problems while others feel lost. Importantly, simple explanation is not about dumbing things down. It's about stripping ideas to their core. The goal is not to remove precision, but to remove confusion. Precision comes from knowing exactly what each part does and why it's there. Once you have that, complexity can be added back deliberately instead of blindly. The habit of explaining ideas simply also changes how you learn new things. You listen differently. You look for mechanisms instead of terminology. You test understanding continuously instead of waiting until the end. Learning becomes active rather than passive. In the end, understanding is not proven by how advanced your language sounds, but by how clearly you can see and communicate the idea. If you can explain it simply, you own it. It's part of your thinking, not just something you've memorized. And when understanding is that solid, learning stops feeling fragile. It becomes fast, adaptable, and reliable because it's built on clarity, not appearance. Many people believe that progress depends on motivation, discipline, or willpower. They wait to feel ready, inspired, or focused before they begin. When those feelings fade, learning slows or stops altogether. This creates a fragile system where progress depends on emotional states that are unpredictable and temporary. But the fastest and most reliable learning doesn't run on motivation. It runs on curiosity. Curiosity works differently. Motivation pushes from the outside while curiosity pulls from the inside. When you are curious, effort feels lighter because attention comes naturally. You don't force yourself to focus. Focus happens as a byproduct of interest. Time passes quickly. Questions arise without effort. Learning becomes something you move toward, not something you drag yourself through. Curiosity also sharpens perception. When you genuinely want to know why something works, your brain becomes more sensitive to details. You notice inconsistencies, you catch assumptions, you ask better questions. This leads to deeper understanding with less repetition. Information sticks not because you tried hard to remember it, but because it connected to a question you cared about. Discipline, by contrast, is limited. It works best in short bursts and breaks down under our complexity. You can force yourself to memorize facts, but you can't force insight. Insight appears when the mind is engaged, not strained. Curiosity creates the mental conditions where insight is likely to occur. Another reason curiosity accelerates learning is that it encourages exploration. Curious learners are willing to test ideas, try variations, and follow unexpected paths. They don't need a perfect plan. They learn by interacting with the subject and seeing what happens. This leads to discoveries that structured study often misses. Exploration builds intuition, and intuition is a powerful form of knowledge. Curiosity also reduces fear. When the goal is to find out what happens, mistakes lose their emotional weight. Errors become interesting instead of threatening. This keeps learners engaged longer and more consistently. Fear drains energy. Curiosity restores it. Importantly, curiosity doesn't require you to love the subject at first. It can be sparked by small questions. What happens if this changes? Why does this part behave differently? What's the simplest version of this idea? These questions are enough to activate curiosity and shift the brain into a learning-friendly state. Once curiosity is active, discipline becomes almost irrelevant. You still show up, but not because you're forcing yourself. You show up because there's something you want to understand. Learning sessions become self-sustaining. One question leads to another. Progress compounds naturally. Curiosity also improves retention. Information learned to satisfy curiosity is remembered longer than information learned out of obligation. This is because curiosity creates emotional context. The brain tags the knowledge as meaningful. It becomes easier to recall and easier to apply. Over time, relying on curiosity changes your identity as a learner. You stop seeing learning as a task and start seeing it as a process of discovery. You become more comfortable with uncertainty because uncertainty is what fuels curiosity. Instead of avoiding what you don't know, you move toward it. This shift has long-term effects. Skills grow faster, burnout decreases, learning becomes resilient instead of fragile. Even when progress slows, curiosity keeps you engaged because the process itself remains interesting. In the end, discipline can get you started, but curiosity keeps you moving. Motivation can push you forward for a moment, but curiosity pulls you forward again and again. When learning is driven by genuine interest, effort turns into exploration, and progress stops feeling forced. That's when learning accelerates, not because you worked harder, but because you learned in a way that aligns with how the mind naturally wants to understand the world. Many people try to learn a skill by starting from the top. They want the full picture first. They study entire systems, long theories, complete frameworks, and broad overviews before they ever touch anything practical. This approach feels responsible, but it quietly creates friction. The mind becomes overloaded. Progress feels slow, and motivation fades because nothing concrete seems to change. Learning stalls, not because the skill is too hard, but because the starting point is too large. Fast learning begins at a much smaller scale. Instead of asking how the whole system works, the better question is, what is the smallest part of this skill that actually does something useful? Not the complete theory, not the perfect method, just one small piece that produces a real result. This piece becomes an anchor. It gives learning direction and purpose. When you start small, learning immediately becomes tangible. You can see cause and effect. You change one thing and observe what happens. This feedback grounds understanding in reality rather than abstraction. The brain learns faster when it can connect effort to outcome. Large systems hide those connections. Small pieces reveal them. Another advantage of starting small is that it reduces cognitive load. The brain can only hold so many moving parts at once. When you try to understand everything simultaneously, details blur and important distinctions are lost. By focusing on one small functional piece, attention sharpens. You can think clearly instead of juggling ideas vaguely. Small pieces also create momentum. Each mastered component builds confidence because it's real. You didn't just study, you achieved something specific. That confidence fuels the next step. Progress becomes visible, and visible progress keeps people engaged. This is why learners who start small tend to continue, while those who start big often quit. There's also a structural benefit. Skills are not random collections of information. They are layered. Some elements matter immediately, while others only make sense later. When you begin with the smallest useful piece, you naturally discover what needs to come next. Learning becomes sequential rather than theoretical. Each new piece has a place to attach. Starting small also exposes assumptions early. When you try to use a tiny part of a skill, misunderstandings surface quickly. You can't hide behind general knowledge. Either the piece works or it doesn't. This clarity saves time. Instead of discovering flaws months later, you correct them immediately. People often worry that starting small means missing important context. In practice, the opposite happens. Context becomes clearer once you have something concrete to relate it to. Abstract explanations make more sense when anchored to experience. Once a small piece is working, larger ideas stop feeling mysterious. They become explanations of something you've already seen. Another overlooked benefit is flexibility. When you understand a skill as a collection of small working parts, adaptation becomes easier. You're not locked into rigid methods. You can swap pieces, modify steps, and experiment intelligently. This leads to deeper mastery over time. Starting small also changes your relationship with mistakes. Errors are easier to analyze when the system is simple. You know exactly what changed and why it failed. This makes learning feel safer and more controlled. Fear decreases, curiosity increases. In the end, speed doesn't come from trying to learn everything at once. It comes from building understanding one useful piece at a time. Small parts create clarity. Clarity creates momentum. Momentum compounds into mastery. When learning is broken down into functional pieces, progress stops feeling overwhelming and starts feeling inevitable. That's when learning accelerates. Not because the subject became simpler, but because your approach became smarter.